Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. Another academic year done. That was my third year as a qualified teacher. 4 years of teaching if you count my training year. And this one's gone by pretty quickly. They seem to be getting quicker. So this will also be the last episode of the 2024-2025 academic year. I've got a couple of things to discuss. And then I'll give you an update on my situation moving into next academic year, because it may affect the podcast. I'm undecided yet. I'm unsure, and I'd welcome your feedback, but I'll speak about that towards the end. First, I've got two things to discuss. I have a colleague who's moving school now. He spent his ECT1 year, his first year as a qualified teacher at Bars Hill. And it wasn't always easy, but he persevered, and I'm really proud of him. Moving on to a different school, and I think he can do good things at that school. But we've had quite a lot of conversations recently about various things, but I think that what's been at the heart of those conversations has been motivation. And it's something that I've spoken about at length on the podcast before. I mean, I think in the very last episode of this podcast's predecessor, so the PGCE podcast, and in the very first episode or several episodes of this podcast, I spoke about how teaching is hard. Teaching is an undoubtedly difficult profession. And if you're going to thrive as a teacher, you need to have a very hot fire burning within you. So that's your source of motivation. It needs to burn fiercely within you in order to, sustain you throughout the trials and tribulations of being a teacher, the emotional ups and downs. You need to have a fierce fire burning within you to do that effectively. If you're this is one of the reasons why I think trying to lure new teachers into the profession with big bursaries, for example, during their training year is a completely useless strategy, because if you're kind of umming and ahhing about being a teacher, you're not actually that bothered, might give it a go, and then this big bursary comes along and you think, oh, great, okay, £30,000 tax-free or whatever it is in my first year, I'll take that, let's go into teaching, let's give this a go. If that's your motivation, I would not describe that as a fierce fire burning within you. That's barely even a flicker of motivation. If you're getting into teaching because you want to get your hands on that big fat bursary, and that's the only reason, or at least that's the overwhelming reason, it's not a good reason to get into the profession, because that sort of motivation won't sustain you. And also, your pay will take a big dip when you go into your first qualified year as a teacher. All of a sudden, the job becomes very, very difficult, and you might not last very long. I mean, you might have found a new motivation along the way, and that probably is the case for some people. They might get into the profession in order to get their hands on that big bursary, but once they're in, they think, this is fantastic, this is what I've been looking for, I'm really passionate about this, and brilliant. If that's what happens, fantastic. I just don't think that always happens. Maybe it only happens in a minority of cases. But anyway, what I'm trying to do here is draw a distinction between the sorts of motivation that can sustain you as a teacher and, the meagre sort of motivation that won't. So I wanted to say a little bit more, and this has come out recently in some of the conversations I've had with this colleague. I wanted to say a little bit more about what I think should ideally be a teacher's source of motivation. And this is inspired by R.S. Peters' famous essay on the philosophy of education called Education as Initiation. I highly recommend it. It's fantastic. So I'll just put it out there and then I'll unpack it a little bit. So I think, let's take a maths teacher, for example, but the same would apply for any subject. So ideally, a maths teacher is on the inside of the mathematical way of life. And I'll unpack what I mean by that in a minute. But a maths teacher is on the inside of the mathematical way of life. And their job as a teacher is to initiate others, especially young people, into that way of life. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, the motivation here comes from two directions. First, they value highly the mathematical way of life. So they're on the inside of this way of life and they love it. And because they love this way of life, they want it to extend beyond themselves, to outlive themselves. And in order to do that, you have to share that way of life with others, especially young people, initiate others into that way of life so that it can carry on. That particular way of life can carry on beyond you. It can, flourish beyond your time. So that's one source of motivation. And the second source of motivation, kind of coming at it from the other angle, from the student angle, is you love this way of life. And the reason you want to share it with these students in particular is because you really value them. You love them too. You love this mathematical way of life. You want it to extend beyond yourself. You want others to participate in that way of life. And you love these young people in your class too. So why wouldn't you want to share something you love with people you care deeply about? So that, I think, should be a teacher's ultimate source of motivation. And if that is your source of motivation, I think that will sustain you through whatever difficulties the profession will throw at you. But I'll say just a little bit more about what I mean by being on the inside of the mathematical way of life. It's noticing and appreciating and understanding certain things that are out there in the world that people who aren't on the inside of the mathematical way of life wouldn't be able to do. And it's valuing the subject for its own sake as well. I mean, mathematics helps us predict and model the world with remarkable, unbelievable accuracy. And we're surrounded by numbers all the time, stats and graphs, every newspaper page is saturated with them. But beyond that, there's also a love for the subject itself. So that's part of what it means to be on the inside of the mathematical way of life. And an important thing to remember is that you appreciate all this as a maths teacher because you are on the inside of that mathematical way of life. And your job is trying to bring people who aren't on the inside of that way of life into it. So that kind of involves reaching beyond that way of life and making contact with those who haven't yet perhaps felt the value of the subject. But you're doing that because you care about the subject and you care about those who you're reaching out to. You want them to care about something that you care about because you care about them. So that's where a teacher's motivation should ultimately spring from. And if it does, that's a renewable, sustainable, never-ending source of motivation. And like I said, it's the same for any other subject. So a geography teacher, for example, is on the inside of the geographical way of life. They will no doubt see the world and perceive the world and notice things and appreciate things in a different way to the maths teacher who's on the inside of the mathematical way of life. But similarly, the geography teacher will want to share that way of life that they value so dearly with young people who they also value so dearly. And that for them would be their source of motivation. They want that geographical way of life to extend beyond themselves and to bring other people into it because they care about those people. And the same for any other subject. Pick any subject you like. I think you can say pretty much the same thing about any subject. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that one. Now, The second thing I want to talk about, it's certainly related to the first thing. It was the last day of school yesterday. And once we've got all the kids out of the way, the staff all gather in order to say their goodbyes to members of staff who are leaving the school. And there's always a few people who, moving on to different schools or different careers or retiring, whatever it might be. So all the staff get together, and the head teacher and sometimes other members of staff as well will say something about the people who are leaving, and then those people sometimes take the opportunity to give a little bit of a leaving speech and say goodbye to everyone. It's really lovely. And it occurred to me when listening to these speeches that if you really want to hone in on what matters in this profession, listen carefully to those speeches. It's all in there. And it reminded me of a distinction that David Brooks makes in his book, The Road to Character. So I've been doing an MA in character education for a few years now. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And one of the first books I read about character education, in fact, it was before I even started the MA, it was towards the end of my PGCE year. It was this book by David Brooks called The Road to Character. And he draws a distinction between what he calls CV, or resume, it's an American book, resume virtues, and eulogy virtues. So think about all the things that you'd write on a resume or a CV in order to get a job. You're going to talk about your competencies and your skills, and perhaps things like your intellectual curiosity, whatever it might be, your team building skills, your determination, your resilience, your industriousness, your resourcefulness, whatever it might be, all those sorts of things. That's the sort of stuff that goes on a CV. And people spend a lot of time writing their CVs, and these sorts of skills are thought about a lot in professional workplaces. They seem to make a difference. However, when someone dies, I guarantee that the sorts of things that people talk about in their eulogies for that person will be completely different to the sorts of things that featured on their CV. So someone's just died, you're standing there at their funeral to deliver a eulogy, or perhaps you're going to write an obituary for the local newspaper, something like that. You're not going to go and get their CV and have a look at their CV and think, oh, this person was good at working within a team, had strong communication skills, and was resilient. Those aren't typically the sorts of things. They might get you a good job, but they're not typically the sorts of things that people are going to talk about in a eulogy. And the point that David Brooks is trying to make by drawing this distinction is he's kind of lamenting the fact that there's so much focus in society on all these technical competencies, when what really matters at the end of the day are the sorts of things that people are likely to discuss in a eulogy, and they are a fundamentally different sort of thing. They are things like honesty, kindness, whether someone was a good friend, a good family member, integrity, humility, bravery. These are the things that at the end of the day really, really matter. And yet, sadly, they don't get much attention in our day-to-day lives, although they are what people tend to talk about after someone's died in a eulogy. So you've got this difference. Another way to characterize the difference is, on the one hand, you've got performance or intellectual virtues. Okay, this is perhaps a more Aristotelian way of putting it. Performance and intellectual virtues. On the other hand, you've got moral virtues, and moral virtues are what ultimately matter. And if you've got someone, for example, who has got loads of performance and intellectual virtues, they're highly competent technically and they're really clever, okay, but they haven't got any of those moral virtues, then that person is potentially quite dangerous. So the idea here is that you want the moral virtues to guide the other virtues, okay, because ultimately they're what really matter. Now, bringing this back to the leaving speeches, it occurred to me that a leaving speech is kind of like a mini eulogy for the end of someone's time with that particular organisation. You know, people are saying goodbye, and you see precisely the same thing appear. So, you know, during the day-to-day life of schooling, and especially like on your CV when you apply for a job in a school, you spend a lot of time talking about performance virtues, intellectual virtues, team building skills, communication skills, etc. But when it comes to the leaving speech at the end, none of those things are mentioned. And in fact, what really matters, what's at the heart of the profession, that's what people spend time discussing in their leaving speeches. So I'd recommend really paying attention to what people say. If you want to learn quickly about what matters in the profession, that's the time to really listen. It's during people's leaving speeches. And I'll just mention 3 things, you know, in general terms. First one, care. You know, in particular, caring for students, and especially caring for these students who, on the face of it, look like they're going to be the hardest to care for. You know, those difficult kids, the ones who make it hard to form a relationship with. Finding a way to care about those kids regardless, you know, through all the difficulties. Caring about them anyway, valuing them for their own sake, and going above and beyond, going the extra mile to make those kids, those difficult, hard kids who've had a rough time, feel cared for. That's a big one. So the first one was care. That came up again and again. That was very much a recurring theme. The second one, a sense of humour. Like when you really step back and take a look at the education profession, the industry, the whole educational enterprise, it's absurd what we're trying to do. It's absurd what we achieve, you know, on a daily basis, on a yearly basis, over the course of young people's lives. It's a mammoth task. And, you know, I think you have to face it with a certain sense of humour. Because often, in certain situations, it's a choice between crying and laughing, honestly. And it's perhaps better to lean towards the side of laughing. You know, so facing that was another one. That was another recurring theme. Facing the absurdities of being a teacher with a good sense of humour. That seems to matter. And then finally, family. So many of the people who are giving their leaving speeches, and many of the other people who are talking about the people who are leaving, spoke about how within their departments they felt like a family unit. And they felt like this profession is really hard, and perhaps as individuals they would struggle to rise to the challenge, but as a family unit, as a department, as a close-knit faculty, they could face any challenge and overcome it. So those were 3 things I noticed, you know, care, humour, and those familial bonds with colleagues. Okay. Right, so I'll do my usual Patreon play, and then I'll just give a quick update on what's going to be happening next year. So this episode took a couple of hours to produce. I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3, once a month, then please consider signing up on the Patreon. And if you do that, you'll be helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a great deal, but any contribution is greatly appreciated. And you'll also gain exclusive early access to unedited videos of my recording sessions. I'll leave the link in the show notes down below, as always. Thank you very much. Right, so a quick update. I've been promising this for a few weeks now, for a few episodes now. So for the past 3 years, I've been a full-time teacher, and I've been doing a part-time master's in character education at the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham, which I've loved. I've loved so much, in fact, that earlier this year I applied to do a PhD. I was accepted. I managed to get some PhD funding as well. So next year, I'm going to drop down to being a part-time teacher. In fact, I'm only going to have one class, just one year 11 class, so 5 hours of teaching a week, spread out across 3 days. So yeah, very part-time. And the rest of the time will be devoted to my PhD research. In a nutshell, I'm more than happy to talk more about this to anyone who wants to hear about it. But often when I start to speak to colleagues about my research, it doesn't seem to be the most gripping topic. I start to see some of my colleagues gloss over a little bit. But in any case, I'm always more than happy to discuss it if anyone wants to find out more detail. But in a nutshell, I'm going to be looking at the role of reflection in moral education. Does encouraging students to think in a certain way help them internalize these moral virtues, these virtues that really matter? That's the question I'm going to look at as a PhD student. So that's what I'll be doing with most of my time over the next, 3.75 years, so nearly 4 years. I'll be a part-time teacher and I'll be a full-time researcher or PhD student. And it's going to be exciting. I'm nervous. I feel like I just started to hit my stride really in teaching. I started to feel like an expert is too strong a word, but I had younger members of staff turning to me for advice, and I felt like I was in a position to give them advice, worthwhile advice. So that's been really rewarding this year for me as a teacher, but I'll be stepping back out into the unknown really next year as a PhD student. I'll be very much considered, the very bottom of the rung in the research or academic world, and we'll just see how I get on. So how's all this going to affect the podcast? Well, I originally thought that at the moment during term, I do 2 episodes a month, so every couple of weeks, produce an episode. I thought originally that because I'm going to be spending, less than half the time in school next year, I thought I would halve the frequency of the podcast episodes, so I drop down to once a month, potentially. But then I spoke with a colleague. Well, it was my supervisor, actually. I spoke with my supervisor earlier in the week, one of my PhD supervisors, and we happened to get onto the topic of podcasts, and we both thought that there's potentially, an opportunity to produce a character-related podcast, a character education-related podcast, or perhaps a practical wisdom-related podcast. And so I thought potentially I could start doing that sort of thing on the podcast. I could start speaking to some of my academic colleagues at the University of Birmingham and elsewhere, perhaps interview them, get them to speak about what they think really matters in education and how their work relates to, the broader question of making sure young people grow up to lead good lives. That sounds like it could be really interesting to me. So as of next year, I think I will reduce the frequency of this sort of episode. So episodes where I talk about, life in schools and teaching, because I'll be doing less of that next year. I think I'll reduce the frequency of this sort of episode. But I might potentially kind of produce like a sub-series where I talk to people about character education. So, I might end up putting out the same number of podcast episodes next year, but some of them might be a bit different to, the sorts of episodes we've gotten used to, which would be good. Like I said a minute ago, I'll be stepping out into the unknown next year, but it's really good to do that. If you want to keep growing as an individual, then you have to keep stepping out into the unknown and doing scary things and changing things up and shaking things up. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, that's a bit of an update on my situation. If you've had any thoughts about anything I've said in this episode, I as always, I encourage you to reach out and let me know. There are various ways you can get in touch. You can have a look in the show notes. You can find all of my social links on my website, which is linked in the show notes. Or I think you can also reach out directly through Buzzsprout. I think there's a send me a message link in the show notes as well. So yeah, please never hesitate to let me know what you think about anything I say. I do really value feedback. And I might do another episode over the summer. We'll see. But if not, we'll talk again in September, and I hope you have a really lovely holiday. You deserve it. Okay, talk again soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Brownpod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. Brownpod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.